All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, so welcome to our Project Destination Clark webinar series. To introduce myself, my name is Chikandi Tangata, and I'm a senior here. For this session, which we're calling Humanities, a faculty panel, we're focusing on the humanities at Clark through the lens of faculty. Our panelists are looking forward to answering your questions on everything from their areas of expertise to how they engage with students in the classroom. Before I have them introduce themselves, though, I want to offer a couple of tips for using this technology. So first, you'll notice that either at the bottom of or in the top corner of your screen, you have both a Q&A feature and a chat feature. These two features have different functions. If you'd like to ask our panelists a question, please use the Q&A feature. If you're having an issue with the technology we're using today, please use the chat feature. And one of our admissions members, Nicole, is behind the scenes. We'll be able to answer some questions live and some via text. We appreciate your patience as we work to share the Clark experience with you. There are a lot of you tuning in right now, so I'd like to apologize in advance if we don't make it to your question. And if you're unable to get to your question during the webinar, or if you think of other questions, we invite you to reach out to us at admissions@clarku.edu. All right, so let's get started. I'm joined today by three faculty panelists, professors, Professor Nina Kushner, Elizabeth Blake, and Wes DeMarco. Can you each take a minute to tell us a little bit about yourselves in the order that I listed you and your role in the Clark community?
So I'm Professor Nina Kushner. I'm an associate professor of history and chair of the history department. I've been at Clark for 14, maybe 15 years. I stopped counting after 10. I am trained as an early modern European historian, and I teach a lot of European history and a lot of history of sexuality, women, and gender.
I'm Elizabeth Blake. I'm an assistant professor in the English department and affiliate faculty in women's and gender studies. My training is in the literature of the first half of the 20th century, which includes modernism, but also includes lots of other things that don't fall under that umbrella. I also work in food studies and in queer studies and teach in both of those fields as well. And this is my first year at Clark, so Wes and Nina may have a little more institutional knowledge than I do, but I know a lot about my field and about the English department specifically.
My name is Wes DeMarco. I muted myself because there's background here. Welcome to everybody who's on the list. A nice group here. I have been at Clark for full-time for about 13 years. I've been teaching for over 30 years. And I'll start by saying, I hope this doesn't sound like advertising, but I've taught at nine different colleges and universities, not because they keep kicking me out, but because I follow my wife in her job. And this is really my favorite place to have taught. I'm quite happy with the institutional culture here at Clark. It's a great place, and I trust that you'll find it so too. My specialties in the field are metaphysics, or what's called first philosophy, the philosophy of reality, ethics, ethical theory, although I work in other areas as well, including aesthetics and a number of others. But welcome.
Perfect, thank you all. So as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing the humanities at Clark. So feel free to submit your questions as they come, and remember to use the Q&A section to ask your questions. Before we get started with the questions, though, I want to explain some Clark-specific academic acronyms that may come up during our panel. So we have the FYI, and it's typically limited to 16 students. This stands for First Year Intensive, or more commonly known as FYI. These courses let you begin your Clark career by developing close relationships with a professor and a group of peers who share your interests. Your FYI professor will likely be your academic advisor until you declare a major and will help you navigate your transition from high school to college. Secondly, we have the Program of Liberal Studies, or PLS, and these courses comprise Clark's core curriculum. The PLS will strengthen your communication and critical thinking skills and enable you to build knowledge in essential areas, including history, the natural sciences, and language and culture. Additionally, students expand their intellectual horizons, explore potential career paths, and refine their interests. We have Problems of Practice, or POP courses, and these are hands-on experiences that take place in an academic context. Questions, significance, faculty, graduate students, alumni, and experts, societies, and media outlets, to government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and NGOs. And finally, the Capstone. Every student completes a LEAP capstone in their major independently or as part of a group. This endeavor will involve advanced work that addresses a significant issue, problem, or theme in a It can take the form of a thesis or project. In consultation with a faculty advisor, you'll define and carry forward the project on your own initiative. So with that, I'm going to start asking our panelists some questions. Can you all hear me? Am I breaking up a bit?
Little bit. It might be me. I don't know. It might be on my end.
Sorry about that. I can also repeat the four if you like. But yeah, let me know if I'm breaking up. I can try and fix that. But to start off with the questions, so panel members will start with a three-part question. Can you tell us a little more about your area of expertise? Have you taught classes that have directly related to your research? And can you give an example or two of the classes and give us an idea of what was taught? And I can repeat that for you. But can we start with Professor Kushner?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm always a little hesitant to answer this question because when I answer it, I then need a very long explanation as to why it's valid and why people should study it. But I actually am a historian of sexuality, and I wrote a book on kept women, and I'm writing in 18th century Paris, and I'm writing one now on adultery in 18th century Paris. And I'm also editing a huge 6-volume series on the cultural history of prostitution, and another on sexuality in France. And I do teach courses on the history of sexuality. I'm teaching one in the fall. I also teach courses in the history of women and gender, and I have an FYI, which, in case you missed it because of the mic issues, are the first year intensive, the pathway introductory course for first years on the witch craze, which is the attacking of women and others and prosecuting them as witches in the early modern period in Europe and then in the US. I guess I use teaching sometimes to explore topics that I find interesting, but I can't commit to, a 5-year research project. So some of my teaching isn't always related to my research, and some of my teaching is because students are interested. We have had a lot of students that want to study medieval history, and we don't have a medievalist. And so I trained in medieval history a bit in graduate school and have read in it for the last 20 years. So I'm like, oh, I can do that. So anyway, that's me.
Thank you. Sounds very. Professor Blake, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so like Nina, I work in sexuality studies, mostly in queer studies in my case, but also in food studies, which are two fields that a lot of people don't think are naturally aligned. But part of what I'm interested in general is literary representations of pleasure and literary representations of pleasure that push past our understanding of what kinds of pleasure are appropriate, acceptable, or normal. And as you can imagine, thinking about writing about eating is one place where that happens a lot. And I've only been at Clark for a year, as I mentioned, but I'm currently teaching a course on food and literature in the 20th century. So really thinking about how writers have thought about what it means to eat, and looking at, in a less literary world, we're reading a bunch of cookbooks, looking at online food videos, looking at cooking shows, thinking about how food exists in literature and in things that don't traditionally get counted as literature. It's a really fun class, and one thing it lets me do is extend some of my research questions beyond the particular historical focus of my research. So my research is all early 20th century, but this class covers the whole 20th century. So normally I stop at about 1950, but in this class I get to keep thinking, and right now we're reading things from the 80s and 90s, and we actually extend all the way into 2016, I think, in this class. So that's a fun opportunity for me to do that. In the fall, I'm teaching a couple of courses on queer literature, including one that's an intro course that's just, I think, called Queer Literature. So again, that sort of extends the historical range of what I get to talk about, which is exciting.
Thank you so much. And finally, Professor DeMarco, would you like to answer the question?
I will answer the question, but I first have to say, boy, my colleagues teach interesting stuff at Clark. And it's not the first time I'll hear someone, describe a course, or I'll see in the catalog some course, and I think to myself, boy, I'd like to take that class, or look at the readings. And I just had that experience again. I don't know if the attendees have the same experience, but boy, that's just delightful and important work. My own work, I mentioned in passing before that my primary areas of training are in metaphysics and ethics, and I've been able to teach in both those, not so much, because the kind of teaching I do at Clark. An example of the first would be a metaphysics class, as we call it, which looks at um, ancient texts, primarily ancient Greek philosophy, and then I book match those with contemporary readings from people in philosophy and in the sciences to show how the conceptual frameworks and basic ideas that evolved quite early in our cultural traditions are still around, helping us to understand and interpret, but also work to shape the research and the ideas that we have in science and philosophy today. So one example would be the claim that reality consists in the physical and nothing more than the physical. Matter is real, there are no immaterial realities. And so we look at ancient atomism, other versions of ancient physicalism, and contemporary defenses of physicalism. And then we also look at critiques of those. So people who would say that there are non-physical realities such as the laws of nature, or mathematical structures, or perhaps mind itself, and so forth. But trying to link up the old and the new is a particular interest of mine, and I'm able to do that in that class. Briefly, another class would be our upper level Theories of Ethics course. And here the course is divided into 3 sections. First, we read some classic texts, ancient and early modern, focusing on Aristotle and Kant and Mill and David Hume. Then in the second part of the class, we look at contemporary representatives of each of those approaches. And then importantly, in the third section, we do critique, feminist critique, environmental critique, Marxist critique primarily, those 3, some others, but primarily those 3. And it's important to me that we both look at the strongest criticisms of the main threads of our tradition, which influence our institutions and practices as much as our ideas, but also that we get the canon right. And oftentimes people get the canon right, but then they don't really understand the critique, or they do the critique, but they don't really understand the canon. So right from the get-go, I think it's important to try to do both of those things. Those would be a couple of examples, and hope that'll suffice.
Thank you very much. Just hearing all of the things that you said, I sometimes wish I wasn't a senior, get another chance to do another semester, take more classes. They all sound very interesting, so thank you for sharing with us. We have a question from the audience, and I think Professor Kushner, you could answer this question. What kind of careers can come from being a history major?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. And that's a question that I get asked a lot. And I think the first thing to realize is that history majors get jobs. They get jobs at the same rate as any other major. So that's the first thing. Some history majors get jobs in history related fields, but the vast majority get jobs in other fields. Our majors have gone on to be Army captains, to be lawyers, to be environmental activists, to be small business owners, to be journalists, cooks, like all kinds of things. Generally, however, what our majors tell us, and what places like the Wall Street Journal also tells us, is that history majors get jobs because of skills that they have. So they have, it's not their historical knowledge, like 10 courses in history isn't going to really give you enough knowledge to really go out and be a practicing historian. But what it does give you is solid research skills, solid writing skills, the ability to present, the ability to take a project and work on your own until you're done, or until you have a question that really requires some help. It shapes your thinking. It allows you to develop skills in qualitative data analysis. So I think there's, if someone's interested, I can send it. I have sort of a PowerPoint on this, and there was a study, I think from 3 years ago, that showed that if history majors get jobs in education more than anything else, but they're not necessarily, so I'm waving my hands like a professor, not more than, not particularly history education. And then after that, it's this really big range. It's just a solid education that allows people to kind of pursue what they want when they graduate.
May I chime in on that, Chikandi?
Yeah, sure.
Pete was just saying that I'm the proud father of a Clarkie who was a history major. And my son graduated in 2014. And though he hasn't entirely given up on the idea of working as a high school teacher, he's thought about that. He wants to get a master's first. He's right now working for Google, a quite decent job. In fact, they just renewed his stay at home. He's able to stay at home, not work, but be paid. They're covering him for a month. So that's, an indication of the quality of the job. But couldn't resist throwing that in as a little drop of personal experience there.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for that additional perspective. Thank you. Another question, and Professor Krishna, this is for you again. Can you talk more about the history major, specifically the capstone requirement?
Okay, so for us, the capstone is sort of integrated into this sequence of teaching students how to do research. And so the first big step is our methods course in the sophomore year called Writing History. And then you do a seminar, and in writing history, you learn how to put a project together and you start one. And then after that, you take seminars, and in seminars you do research as well, and you write papers, and they're very involved, and they're based on primary sources. So capstone is just along that route. It's not, and it's just a bigger, longer project that has more sophisticated questions, but it's usually done in the context of a seminar. However, we have students that do them as independent studies because they're questions they want to ask that are not questions that are well suited to the seminars that are offered that term. And we also have students that sometimes instead of that do a year-long project where they have really big questions and they really want to devote most of their time their senior year to figuring them out. So that's our capstone. It's really sort of sequenced and integrated into our major.
Thank you. Our next question is, how easy is it to double major? Is it easier to double major in 2 humanities majors than in, say, 1 history major and 1 science major? Professor DeMarco, would you like to take it? Or
yeah, I can grab it. So most majors are 10 to 12 courses, and you have 32 courses to graduate, and then the PLS, I can't remember how many that is, but it's like 8 or 9. I should know this. So if you double major, you might have 20 to 24 courses required to do that. And then you can sometimes you can work your PLS requirements into those majors. So there's plenty of room to double major in 2 humanities. The one time that it gets a little tricky is if you want to major in something like biochem. Biochem is a big major, it's very sequenced, but I have 2 students who are double majors in biochem and history. If you're going to do something that involved, you sort of need to think it through pretty early. But plenty of students double major, students major and triple minor. There are all kinds of arrangements that folks come up with.
thank you. Professor Blake, would you like to answer this question? Can you talk more about queer studies at Clark?
Yeah, so obviously I'm new, but one thing that I've been really excited about since getting here is that there is a lot of student interest in queer studies, and there are a lot of faculty who are doing work in queer studies in multiple disciplines. So I'm teaching 2 classes in queer studies in the fall, and there's another faculty member in screen studies, Rock Sommer, who does amazing work in queer studies. There's Bob Tobin, who teaches in comparative literature, and there's John Palea, who teaches in the Women's and Gender Studies department. So there is a really great and really, I think, enthusiastic number of faculty teaching in this. And I know that I'm missing people when I make that list. And one thing that is sort of in the works for the future is a faculty collaborative in sexuality studies. So we'll be having more conversations and thinking about ways to expand that, both in our research collaboration and in possibly offering courses together. I know that for me, coming in as a new faculty member doing this kind of work, which often doesn't happen in small liberal arts colleges to the extent that it does here, it's been really exciting to see both faculty engagement and student enthusiasm. It's really clear that students are hungry for this kind of thinking, and that's been really fun and exciting. And so I've already started supporting some student research separately from my classes in these fields, and that's been really wonderful.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, we have another question, and I know Professor Kushner, you mentioned how you'd be happy to talk about any fifth year or advanced degree program questions. So the question is, how does your fifth year program work? For example, can a psychology student apply for the program, or is the program only open to specific majors?
Okay, so just to start with, not every department has a fifth year program. History does, English doesn't. It has an independent master's program that you apply for separately. So in history, in order to get into the fifth year program, you need to do the honors program in history. However, because that's our feeling, like if you're going to do a master's in history, you need to do an undergraduate thesis, and that's training for the master's. But there are other fifth year programs on campus, like education, where you don't need to major in that department, in that field. You just have to fulfill certain requirements and you're eligible for that fifth year.
Can I add on to that?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, we do have a separate master's in the English department, and we have had Clark students apply and be students in that master's program, and we do not require that they are English majors in their undergraduate experience. So that I think we've had at least one Clark student who was not an English major complete the master's.
Great, thank you. All right, so while research is an important part of being a Clark professor, interacting with and mentoring students is of equal importance. Panelists, can you describe your general approach to working with undergraduate students? And Professor DeMarco, would you like to start with that?
Sure, it's hard to, by the way, I've moved in front of a window, so I'm not a shadowy figure as I was. I was watching and suddenly noticed that the light here in my room had changed, and anyway, that's the reason for the change in appearance. It's difficult to describe in general what that is. I try to work with students as individual persons with individual evolving interests and so forth. In classroom settings, I'm sort of notorious for lots of comments on papers, and I try to draw students into engagement over their work. And by no means am I alone at Clark in that, but the idea, I find that students are often, frankly, somewhat surprised that here is someone, as university faculty are, expert in a field, taking their ideas seriously and listening to them and actually hearing what they're saying, being critical, and so on. And that's an important piece. A second part would be working with students on theses and on final papers for courses. A third piece would be the development of papers for presentation at professional meetings. And I've had, I don't know what it is, 15 or 16, maybe not that many now, 14 or 15 of those during my time here at Clark, where a student will write a paper for me in a class, and I'll say, hey, this is good. I'll work with the student one-on-one to tweak it up a little bit, and then they'll present it at a professional meeting in philosophy or in some related field. We've had students fly to other cities and do this, or drive to our area in New England here, where we have our Northern New England Philosophical Association, which is a regional professional society. And students often enter with trepidation, but uniformly, I can't think of a single exception where the student has not had a fantastic experience with that sort of event. So those are three ways right there.
Thank you. Would Professor Blake or Professor Krishna, would you like to add anything on to that question?
I'm happy to, but do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I want to echo most of what Wes has said. And one thing I've really enjoyed about my time at Clark so far is the real interest in students. I think one thing that I like about all of my colleagues here is that we all take students seriously, and that students have risen to respond to that and really expect that level of engagement from us, which is really exciting. Anecdotally, I think most of the students that I talk to are double majors, are doing multiple things, and I'm working with a student doing a BA thesis, working with a student doing a capstone, and they're all really trying to bring together lots of different modes of thought in ways that are exciting. And I take my job to be to sort of help them organize that sometimes, to say, okay, here are some other directions you might come from, here are some other ideas that might be helpful, but really not to not to put my own ideas into them, but to bolster and support the ideas they already have. And my experience so far has been that they already have a lot of really exciting ideas. Nina, you wanna?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I was thinking about this from a slightly different perspective, which is that the first thing I think about is that the student is giving me the gift of their time, and you all are giving us the gift of sending your students to us. And I take that seriously. So I just, whether we're in the classroom or somewhere else, that I'm not going to waste their time. But it's interesting because that's often in tension with this other thing of really trying to get students to own their education. When you have students who are doing independent research, they're already there. But a lot of other students, especially in the first couple of years, aren't quite understanding that this is theirs. It's theirs to do with what they want, that what they put into it is what they're going to get out of it. And that's sometimes, that's something that I and my colleagues also try and convey. This is yours, right? We're going to take you seriously, and we want you to take this seriously. And so those are sort of two approaches. That being said, then I like to aim right over their heads. So like not really high, but just over their heads, just to push really hard. And it depends. Like if it's someone I know I'm just going to have for a semester, like it's a general introductory course, students are often there because they're trying to fulfill a requirement. I'm like, well, I have you for one semester. What is it that we can do together that will really help you in the future? And I see Wes nodding. And it's often critical writing. Like, how about we learn to construct an argument? Because no matter what you do from here on out, whether it's to convince someone to lend them the car, or whether it's to ask for a raise, or whether to make a point about a policy, argument is important. But in order to improve, you have to kind of frustrate students a little, and that's also important, to sort of work on frustration tolerance. And I think the last thing is really, as a historian, I think the thing that I think is really important is to help students, and I think also actually this is true in any humanities, really any field, but I think humanities in particular, is to help students understand the frameworks in which they're operating. So let's say, that they understand that, given, let's take something I'm really interested in, which is the history of marriage, and people talk about a particular model, and our students will say, oh, this actually emerged at this moment in time. And when people today use this model, these are the stakes. This is what it means. And so students emerge from all their studies seeing trees rather than forests, and being able to identify the frameworks around them so that as citizens, they can make decisions that are really based on critical thought and understanding the world around them. So that's kind of how I approach it. Some of them are universal, like taking their time seriously, trying to get them to own their own education, pushing just a little bit past where they're comfortable. And then the rest just depends on where they are. And as Wes said, just meeting them as individuals and figuring out, what it is that we can do together in the time that we have.
Thank you all for the very thoughtful answers. All right, for this question, we can probably go down the line again. So we can start with Professor Kushner, then Professor Blake, then Professor DeMarco. What is the typical size of classes in your department? And discuss or lectures?
Okay.
Sorry, did I cut out? I can repeat the question if you like.
Sure.
Sorry about that. What is the typical size of classes in your department, and are most primarily styled?
Okay. So for us, we have pretty big classes. So our for Clark, so our introductory classes, we actually just reduced the cap to 44 because the classrooms that we want to use on campus can fit 44 bodies. And we may reduce them further moving forward. That's our big introductory classes, like history of Europe, right? Then when you get into the 200 or the more specialized classes, the caps are 35, and those are what we call lecture discussion. So the professor will do some lecturing, but there'll be intermittent discussion, or there'll be full classes devoted to discussion. And then our seminars, I think they're 14. Often they're 16, so I get confused, but they're it's like good for a chair to know this, right? So they're 14, and those are, you read a certain amount per week, and you just sit there and you discuss the texts in a single or 2 sessions a week.
Yeah, our classes are mostly smaller than that, and we don't have a lot of lecture classes. I'm currently teaching a seminar that's capped at 20. Our seminars range from, oh, it looks like we've got a tech problem. Can anyone hear me? You can? Okay, so maybe not. All right, it's flashing on the bottom of my screen, but I'll ignore it. Okay, so our classes range from being capped at 15. All of our creative writing classes are capped at 15, and some of our literature classes are capped at 15 to, I believe the highest is 35 in the English department. But sometimes classes end up being smaller than that. We have a pretty broad range right now of introductory classes. So for example, I'm actually teaching the second half of the British Literature Survey, and right now the course is 9 students, which is really luxurious. So we're getting a chance to really dig in and run it as a seminar, which is really lovely. It means that these students are getting a very different experience of these texts than they get if I was lecturing. So right now my big intro class is smaller than my seminar. So there's definitely a range of what that looks like in English, but almost all of our classes, you're going to be in conversation. You're going to be really bringing your own thinking and reading to the texts and contributing as much as.
Liz, you sort of cut out at the end there, but I wasn't sure if you were finished. I don't want to butt in. So I would say that in philosophy, I divide the class size into 3 groups. One would be what we call service courses, sort of the jargon of the trade. Those are general interest courses, or those which might be taken to satisfy a program of liberal studies requirement. You get that values, perspective, attribute, or what have you. Second would be classes for the major. Not all of those are seminars, but they are either seminars which have, often capped at 15 or 20, and sometimes the attendance will be less. We'll have maybe 10, 12 people in a class, sometimes 8, and those are delightful. I don't get to do too many of those as a lecturer, but those are really wonderful, intensive courses. But the regular non-seminar major courses were typically capped at 20 or 25. Most of the courses I teach are capped at 30 or 35. They're mostly the service courses. I do get to do sabbatical replacements and that sort of thing, where I'll teach a seminar or a capstone or upper level class. So there's a range, but the range is appropriate to the kind of subject matter and the level of the course.
Can I just jump back in for a sec? I think that what Liz and Wes and I are demonstrating is that departments think pretty seriously about what the needs of their students are, and also what the needs of the university is. And so departments decide their caps, right? There's not this universal thing, and you can't teach these texts in English in a bigger class. You can teach, an intro survey in a larger class. So it's a very mindful process, right? How we set these caps. And I know in my department, we rethink them all the time. Like, is this working? Given the nature of how students are changing, should we change how we're teaching? Pedagogy is alive. It's not like you write your courses and then you just teach the same thing for 20 years and the department never thinks about what's going on.
Can I add to that? Yeah, I think this is also thought on the level of what kind of class it is, but also on the level of subject matter of the class, in that my intro class for major British writers has a much higher cap than my intro class in queer literature, in part not because we expect less student interest in the queer literature class, but because it requires a smaller space, because we want it to be someplace that can feel safer for students who are engaging with potentially difficult material.
Thank you for all your answers. Hello, can you still hear me?
A little distortion, but it comes through now.
Sorry, I think it's very windy today, so that might be messing up my internet. But Professor Blake, we have a question. How easy is it to get into creative writing classes as a non-English major?
So I don't teach creative writing classes. I am not a creative writer, but my sense is that it's very easy. We actually have a lot of creative writing minors who are not English majors. The creative writing minor is run through the English department. all of the creative writing classes are run through the English department. But I don't think it's even true, and I could be wrong, but I'm not even sure it's true that the majority of creative writing minors are English majors. So non-English majors definitely take these classes. They're very popular university-wide. We have creative writing minors who are other humanities majors, but we also have students who are biochem majors who are doing things that seem totally disparate, who find creative writing courses to be an exciting and fulfilling part of their education.
Thank you for that. Another question, how often do students meet with their advisors in your departments, and how many students does each advisor work with? Professor Kushner, would you like to start with that question?
Wait, it's how many do we each have?
How often do students meet with their advisors in your department, and how many students does each advisor work with?
Okay, so it depends. It depends. And I've had as few, I think right now I have 7 advisees, and I've had as many as 33, which is not fun. But in mostly humanities, I think the loads are pretty low. And in history, the student picks the advisor, so sometimes you end up with a lot of students. When you teach an FYI, you end up with all those students as your advisees. So if you do a bunch of FYIs in a row, you tend to have a lot. As far as how often an advisor and advisee meets, that's really dependent on who the people are. So for my FYIs, my first years, I'd see them twice a week. And then in the second semester, I try to see them like every 2 weeks. After that, usually students just decide when they're going to see you. If there's someone who I think is having trouble, I'll reach out. Some students I've met with every single week because they just needed the structure to figure out how to get through the week that followed. And some students I see just at the one time a year where it's mandated, which is when you're picking courses for the next semester. So from my experience is that it's incredibly individualized. I don't know if that's your experience, Liz and Wes.
Yeah, I'd say that matches up with my experience. Similarly, in English, students choose their advisors, and it varies a lot. I'd also note that students can meet with faculty who aren't just their advisors regularly. I have several students who come to my office hours frequently who either took classes with me last semester or in classes with me now to talk about what they're doing in their academic program, how things are going, think about future classes. So that does happen even outside of those relationships. And I think that's true in almost every department, that people are willing to have those meetings, have people come to office hours and have those conversations, even if you're not in a formal advisor-advisee relationship.
I think that's true. I'd second those things, except perhaps for the numbers, which vary somewhat. Also, right now, the system at Clark is that you will have a number of different advisors. You have your academic advisor. You might have a major or minor advisor, depending on if you have a double major or something. And then also a LEAP advisor. But just thinking from the standpoint of academics, because I teach a lot of FYIs, in fact, I think over the time I've been here, there was only 2 semesters or 2 falls when I didn't teach an FYI. That tends to bring my numbers up. So right now, I mean, typically I have between 24 and 50 advisees, and right now about a dozen are majors or minors, and the rest are first-year people or second-year people who have yet to choose their majors or leave my fold and go off in pursuit of a dedicated major. But yeah, it varies widely. Some people you really want to see and have to see once a week. Others, a couple of times a semester. So part of that is choice. Part of it is the gentle nudges of your advisor if the need is perceived. But it's a good system overall, I think.
Thank you. Almost one final question. So faculty members, as many of our audience members are on the verge of their college experience, can you give one final piece of advice to the viewers? And we can go in line again. So Professor Kushner, Professor Blake, and then Professor DeMarco.
Well, if you're here, you're already interested in humanities. And I just want to give a little bit of a plug for the humanities anyway, which is that if you go to a liberal arts school, you're interested in having this well-rounded, having this really broad, well-rounded education. The humanities teach you to think. I always think we should have this poster campaign, like, can you tell right from wrong? Thank the humanities. Like, is this pretty? Can you tell? Thank the humanities. It's a really good thing to study. Like it allows you to take the world apart, right? To understand it better, to be able to make claims convincingly. And I've seen tons of studies on philosophy and history, how they lead to jobs. I'm sure English is the same, but I haven't seen them, sorry. So I can't make that claim because evidence. So I think that would be my final thing, is like, don't be afraid. Don't feel like you have to major in political science, or that you have to major in chemistry if in fact you want to major in history or English or philosophy or any other humanities field, because it will be fine.
Yeah, I want to second everything Nina just said, and note that the studies are there for English too. But also encourage you to take classes that you're not necessarily sure what they're going to be like, to go outside of your comfort zone. This is one of the great things about a liberal arts education, is the opportunity to take something that you don't fully understand yet what it is and discover something new. And I think all of us are in fields that encourage modes of thought that are exploratory, that are evidence-based, but also open up new possibilities. And you can't necessarily know which new possibilities are going to be exciting to you yet. So there's more stuff out there that is there for you to explore and try things, basically.
I love both of those comments, and I have to say, risking another sort of meta comment, that's excellent advice, eloquently expressed, and there you have the humanities, right? A living advertisement in the manner in which it was said, as well as the content of what is said. I guess the thing that I would add, and this is something I had to learn from experience, because I didn't necessarily put academics first in the beginning of my college career, but to jump into the deep end, immerse yourself, to put your academics first, but experience and explore widely, to attend, but also to inquire, to absorb information, but also to question. These are wonderful opportunities, these years you will have with us, let's hope, and relish them. It's a wonderful adventure. And thank you for all.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Professor Kushner, Professor Blake, and Professor DeMarco, for answering all those questions, for sharing your insight with everyone. So we hope you learn more about the humanities at Clark, and we do have more Project Destination Clark events coming up, all designed based on what you told us you'd like to learn more about. So you can check out our website, clarku.edu/admitted/webinars for the full list. But next up is a webinar on visual and performing arts at Clark, which will be another faculty session. And it's scheduled for April 13th at 4 p.m. So definitely check that out. And thank you all for tuning in. We had a lot of fun answering your questions, and hope you'll get in touch if we can help with anything. So until next time, have fun, stay healthy, and stay safe.